to start immediately, fast, on the best practices for the digital economy regulation. So things are moving on. So we don't just talk about telecommunication anymore. We talk about digital economies. And we have two incredible speakers. Thanks to both of them for joining us. We have Preiskel, the senior partner at Preiskel & Co., and Arun Dehiri, the managing director of Red Dawn Consulting. Thank you both. I will leave you alone here after this introduction. Do make sure that you have a red button pressed in front of you so you can speak, so they can hear it from you from out there, online as well. Thank you. Danny, your chance to open up as a moderator.
Thank you, Dario. It's a real pleasure to be here and see the progress of MEF over the last 23 or so years. I've got a particular connection with MEF, having been the lawyer who helped found it, following Andrew Budd's visions. So in fact, I've been involved with MEF longer than MEF itself has been in actual creation. So it was hugely heartwarming to see the impressive MEF Global Forum in action yesterday, and a huge pleasure and honour to be part of its ongoing activities today. As Dario mentioned, I telecom specialised lawyer and very much involved in the telecoms regulation, which will be impacting on all the MEF members. And often my work, we bring in leading telecoms consultants to do the real work, and most importantly, Arun Dehiri, with whom we've worked on projects across the globe affecting the mobile ecosystem. So over to you, Arun.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Dario, for the very warm welcome. I'm new to the MEF, but not new to the ecosystem, and I've been skirting around for about 30 years. And along that journey, I have advised many telcos and companies globally on all topics, commercial, regulatory, strategic, and operational. And one of the pleasures I've had in that journey is meeting Danny and his firm, and we've done a lot of work together over the years. One of the things we're going to be talking about today is kind of built around a case study on a project we worked together. We can't mention the names, obviously, because it's confidential, but we can definitely mention the learnings, because they're quite generic. And so without further ado, I think we should just walk through our topic today. I think we've got the clicker, haven't we, to flick through the slides?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it that one?
Yeah, what I will say is an intro. As we sit here, hopefully listening to us and enjoying Mobile World Congress, you have to be aware that regulators across the world, governments, are working out how to further regulate our industry. And that is partly why we're here, to really bring out and share our understanding of their way of thinking, and most importantly, to give us as a MEF an opportunity to influence and shape the future regulation.
Yeah. Just want to get the slides working, if I could.
Yeah,
okay,
it's definitely
great.
behind. Yeah.
Okay, great. Right, so in terms of perfect, we're working. Tech is working, right? So the real, as Danny mentioned, we're really going to just go through quite quickly. I want to manage our expectations because we've got a little bit lazy. The slides are a little bit busy, but don't worry about that. We're not going to present all of it. We're just going to suck out the highlights, and if you want to get the slides later on, please reach out to us, and we'll happily furnish you with them. We're going to first of all sort of talk about the objectives of the regulation. As I mentioned, built around a case study of an advanced economy regulator that wants to be, world leading. The first thing that I wanted to say before we get into this is that what we've learned from this is that you cannot look at regulation in isolation. You need to look at it with the industry and what's happening from an industry perspective, and the two need to come together to formulate a cohesive strategy. And that was the challenge we faced, and we have faced. And where we're going to work together today is Danny's going to cover everything, the clever stuff, regulatory and enactments, and I'm going to cover the industry sort of related. So we'll pair up that way. That's how you'll get a good rounded picture. So the first thing that we wanted to do is to kind of set out a little sort of framework of how we go about building a regulatory kind of framework. And the first thing we want to do in any sort of project like this is to define a strategy. What is the vision of the economy in terms of, is it innovative, sustainable? Everyone has different. We're going to come back to this, and we're going to explain how different countries think, and they think very differently from each other. And then the objectives of any sort of project like this is understanding regulation, building up best practices, is basically clarifying the roles of individual stakeholders. We're going to come back to this point, okay? And also, one of the objectives we found is very important is how do we improve our rankings within the global indices. That's a key indicator, a specific metric, very important, and we'll come back to that. And the approach we're sort of taking with all of this is to really interview all the stakeholders, what they want out of the economy, where we're going, look at all the regulation which Danny will talk about, and basically come up with a governance model to implement these changes. So that's kind of the approach we're taking. Did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you've summed it up very, very well.
Okay.
Really
good. So then,
appreciate it. So I think just one thing is, wherever we're mentioning, the regulator and the government's approach to regulation, there is an opportunity there, and an important opportunity for the industry to feed in its position to make sure, as I mentioned, that we shape it the way that best fits our industry and your particular industry that you represent here at MEF.
So sticking with the objectives of countries, now we're going to come back to how we've picked these countries, okay? So just to kind of give you some teasers right now, and we'll all come together as, oh yes, that's how you've come up with this. Bizarrely, there are some countries which counterintuitively you wouldn't think were so advanced in certain things because they're smaller or perhaps not so publicly prominent, but nonetheless very, very interesting and very creative. So there's a general philosophy that different countries have when regulating, and we've tried to get to the heart and the nub of that and summarise that in. So let's just a quick example. So Estonia has a very advanced e-government kind of environment, and they're trying to become fully digitalised, and they've got specific agendas around that. Switzerland, human capital comes up as being the people, the primary kind of aspect that they try to regulate, and not regulate people, but regulate the environment for them to thrive, and that skills and that sort of bringing investment to them. Singapore, on the investment theme, very much about attracting and bringing on board investment into the country, and UK is about digital government, digital society, and that's more prominent recently.
And on the UK, what I would add, a word of warning is that with the UK's real determination to make it, the best place in the world to start digital businesses and to grow, and they're doing a very, very good job. After Brexit, there is a huge focus on legislation that is divergent to the European Union legislation, which unfortunately for many of us here means you've got to actually comply with both EU legislation and the new UK legislation. So that's one of the downsides, one of the perhaps many downsides of Brexit. You do need to unfortunately keep track of the UK legislation, even if it is going to be more pro-industry. You do need to be aware of that. So that's something to keep an eye on, especially for those operating in Europe and the UK.
Thanks. Okay, so let's move on to the next sort of item, which is really around what is it we're regulating, right? We've got a digital economy. It's a very broad term, right? So the question is, how do we break that down? And as any good consultant, we take a problem, we break it down into parts, and we solve the parts in isolation, and it solves the big problem. That's kind of how we've approached this regulatory kind of conundrum. And we've come up with we've done a benchmarking exercise across the entire globe. You might not be able to read this, but I'll just kind of highlight the main boulders. There's about 46 trends or components of the economy that we've identified across the globe. And we've created layers. So the infrastructure layer, which sets the fabric, the enablement layer, which is a key topic we'll come back to, as a platform to lead to e-services. And then there's a new kind of more prominent trend now, which is around external factors, things like sustainability, social good, these sorts of things, which is actually the main reason why I joined the MEF with Dario's blessing. And basically that is because I believe in that this is the way forward for the industry and the MEF to sort of look at things like, not just technologies, but how it impacts people and lives, right? The main takeaway from this slide, busy slide, is that there are some very specific core things that drive everything. And if there's one takeaway, which Danny will talk about the regulatory side of this, is data. Data is the glue that we've found glues all of this together. If we get that right, customer data, and linked to that is cybersecurity. Okay, so these are the two sort of main topics. And Danny will talk in a minute about some regulation that's happening around that. But there's a lot of sort of, just to pick out a couple of big topics, things like satellite and the convergence of satellite with cellular and low-powered networks. These sorts of things are happening. So another sort of takeaway from this is convergence of these topics. We cannot look at them in isolation. Like I said, we've broken it down, but we're going to put it back together again when we talk in a little bit. IoT. How do we manage OTTs? These are all new concepts. So we have to keep abreast of new things that are happening. The VR world, Meta, this is all new stuff. How do we future-proof all this? So we mustn't create a framework or regulatory environment that's sticky to just the current technologies. It's about themes. And the final point on this section really is that we've come up with what we call horizontal components. And we've got competition, which covers everything. We've got consumer protection, which covers everything. We've got data, which I mentioned. We've got intellectual property. And we've got digital rights and also startups. These are the things that the economy that we looked at were very interested in, is horizontal. And then you've got industry specific. Danny, would you like to talk about some regulation around data?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, as Arun said, we found that really data just straddles every element of the industry and obviously the mobile ecosystem. And, we've just got to be aware about all the new data regulations that are coming through. Obviously, in Europe, we've had the GDPR, but that's had extraterritorial effect. It affects pretty much every member of the MEF, wherever they're based. They're going to have, at some point, there's going to be data of a European subject. The European Union is really taking an extraterritorial effect, and we've come to live and understand GDPR as part of life, but it's incredibly expensive complying with GDPR. It's almost impossible to fully comply with GDPR. There's a balance to be. But it's so important. In the Europe, we've actually got 4 different acts on data now, 3 relatively recent ones. That's how important the European Union is taking it. We've got the Data Act, and we've got GDPR, and then we've got the Data Act. Then we've got EU Data Governance Act as well, and then you've got the EU Cyber Resilience Act. So that's how important data is and how heavily it's being regulated. Having said that, the Data Governance Act and the Data Act, a lot of those will be potentially beneficial to our industry. It's talking about getting better access to public data. It's who has the rights in the data generated by IoT devices. This can all be very, very beneficial to us if we understand it and are involved in shaping, and something that I'll be certainly talking with the IoT working group to see to what extent we can help shape the data act to help those in the IoT space. So that's just really showing, from our studies, obviously data is so important. It's being heavily regulated now. For major pieces of legislation in Europe, it's going to cost us money to invest in it, but we've got to make it work. The rest of the world is also looking to regulate data, and we've got to be on top of it. So I think that's partly the area that I wanted to emphasise and flag up, which is born out of the work we've been doing for this government on digital best practice.
And to your point about IoT, for example, just picking that as an example, regulators and governments, forgive me for saying this, but perhaps are less involved with the actual workings of those topics. So within IoT, for example, there are different layers that need to work together to give a productive environment. For example, we need connectivity to be accessible. So there's one element of regulation. Then you need a platform to make it work. And then you need to have industry-specific things in terms of making, for example, if we're talking about critical communications, if we haven't got regulation around access to quality and contiguous coverage, that could be a problem. So we have to look at all this together. And that's why, my mantra is basically that the industry and the regulators and government need to work hand in hand, which is why Danny and I work together to sort of create a combined experience. So just moving on to the benchmarks. Now, I don't want to dwell on this, but just to make the point of how we've gone about it. Forget the sort of business of this slide. Just focus on the last column, if you like. And what we've done is we've benchmarked about 50 or so countries, and we've said, right, which ones of these are innovative, creative, forward-thinking. Which ones have got a very structured approach where data is easy, information is easy to find. A lot of it's a mess, to be honest. But these particular countries, how we kind of, I mentioned some of them already: Estonia, UK, Switzerland, Singapore, South Korea. These are the sort of top ones that we looked at for this particular economy. And there are some secondary countries that have got specific aspects. For example, it could be to do with cyber, it could be to do with e-government, it could be to do with IP, could be to do with data. So some countries have one particular thing they're really good at, and some have an overall framework. So when we're regulating, it's really useful to understand which countries do what. Again, super busy slide, but the number one in this particular thing, sort of KPI that this government and the ministers wanted, the Prime Minister wanted, was, I want to basically be very high up in the global indices, the rankings. Okay, so because it's so busy, might not be able to read, I will just call out a couple. So really, some of the indicators are things like global connectivity, very, very interesting KPI, e-government, digital adoption, percentage-wise, is very, very interesting. And what we've done is we've said, well, the colour coding, which is quite difficult to see on this particular format, it shows that it picks up the countries and how they rank against all of these. And you can see that the ones I mentioned rank quite highly. So really hard to find this information, but very, very useful, and it gives us a good sort of steer as to where to go. So that's kind of a practical kind of way. So if we want to help, if the MEF, for example, wants to help economies to thrive, this is a really good way of demonstrating whether or not there has been success through these indicators. So then, in terms of all these countries, we've sucked out some best practices here. I'm going to hand over to Danny to talk about the legal and other sort of instruments first, and then I'll come back to the commercial aspects.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. I think the European Union is a world leader on regulation, and one element where we've seen a huge improvement for our industry has been the lighter touch licensing regulation throughout the EU member states. So in the past, if you had an IoT product, you had to get a license in every single country, and it was a real pain. Now, bad enough for a telco company providing a SIM, but if you're, say, a watch manufacturer and you want to provide a watch with an embedded SIM, in theory, in a lot of the EU regulation countries, how they've interpreted, you would have had to apply for a license even though you're a watch company, and actually the license forms aren't actually even geared to a watch company that just happens to have an embedded SIM. So generally, the EU has over the years reduced the burden on those IoT providers. Some countries still take what we see in the UK is quite a sort of, I would say, backward or sort of old-fashioned approach. Still do require notifications, which is very disappointing, but over time that burden, has been reduced. So, you could have in some EU countries, car manufacturers that got embedded SIMs will actually have to apply to have a notification. So that's just the process of, really reducing the regulatory burden that really gets in the way of some quite innovative IoT products potentially in the EU. We're not quite there, but with our help over the years, it has got better. Otherwise, in the EU, I mentioned there's a lot of raft of recent legislation, hot on the heels of the GDPR. We've got the AI Act for AI. So many of our companies are now using AI. We've got the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act. Hey, coincidentally, we've got a session on that in half an hour's time, which I'm honoured to be moderating. We've got the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, and the Cyber Resilience Act, just in the European Union. But as mentioned, they will be having extraterritorial effects. So please bear that in mind.
Yeah, so we're kind of running a bit short of time, so I'm going to go a little bit fast, but just summarise in a few words the main takeaways from this. So the non-legal and regulatory aspects, I promised that I would talk a bit more about that. So in terms of best practices, what we're seeing is that having independent, dedicated bodies to coordinate the nationwide strategies is very important. Collaboration between private and government for digital transformation, very important. Getting political support and support from the stakeholders is critically important. Having trust in data. We're finding having open data portals and that sort of thing very, very useful. And support R&D, digital skills is the biggest gap we're finding. In terms of the components, really it's around, I mentioned data, the increase in use of data. And this whole idea of platform as a service is really emerging, and that needs to be sort of thought through. Open API standards, so it's not just regulation but also standardization, which is, I guess, what the MEF does a lot of thinking about. Social media regulation, we feel, is quite poor, and we can talk about that because it's impacted my family for sure. I'm sure whoever's got children would understand that. Subject close to my heart. And cybersecurity is being a major issue, which people don't really fully understand yet, the impact, but it's happening. So just sort of, I'm only going to call out one of these in terms of the building blocks, just because of time. Singapore. This is a kind of framework, how it might look in terms, everyone's different, but they have this, they want to be Singapore as a leading digital economy which continually reinvents itself. And they want to accelerate, compete, transform, and they have these pillars. So this is how we've done this for the economy we're working with, is taken all the components, all the best practices, all the hopes and desires of the Prime Minister to be globally dominant, and come up with a particular framework which looks a bit like this. And each country has got a different framework. That we've seen for other countries as well, but I won't go through this because I think we're short of time. So the last thing to say is about stakeholders, and the main point that we wanted to, Danny and I, we talked about this. What is our main theme here? Is that we feel that there are enterprises we need to involve in this discussion. There are individuals, think tanks, startups, R&D companies, there's integrators, and there's government at the end of the day, who have got different ministries, regulators, etc. So we feel that the MEF is a great glue, could be a great glue, which is why I've joined, to help this happen, to make sure that everyone's voice is represented in the right way, to create effective regulation. Anything you'd like to add?
No, thanks, Arun. I mean, the slides are available if you want copies of the slides, and there's much more than what we've actually shared. Then contact us or Dario, and we'll be very happy to provide copies of those slides. And normally we'd open the floor to questions, but I think we are out of time. But Arun and I are going to be around for much of the rest of the day, so feel free to ask us in the various coffee breaks, etc. But I think it's important that we keep an eye out on what's going on globally, which will directly impact and hopefully benefit our members.
Thank you very much.